This is Michael Popok with Legal AF. There's been a lot of press and ink spilt about the criminal prosecution of the Trump organizations and their 17 counts of felonies, and questioning why the fine was so low on the criminal side when they were sentenced. And to further explain that, we picked up on it on Legal AF this past weekend. I thought it would be important to do a little bit of a primer of the differences and how the statutes fit together so perfectly in New York State on the civil side and the criminal side, with a legislature who understands they have a civil code and a penal code, a criminal code, and they work hand in glove. So when you look at them independently, I know a lot of people, including people that follow and listen to our show, were up in arms with the $1.6 million in total fine that Judge Merchan issued in response to the 17 counts of tax fraud in New York State. But frankly, you can't blame the Manhattan DA, Alvin Bragg. You can't blame Judge Merchan. And you can't blame anybody, because when I explain the powers of the New York Attorney General and all the powers that she has under the executive law of New York, you'll understand why the criminal fine part of the criminal penal code in New York is so low, because they, as I said, they fit together symmetrically, and the two offices, the New York Attorney General and the Manhattan DA, or any DA's office in the state of New York, work together in that way. Let's start on the criminal side. On the criminal side, if it's an individual, there's no limits. There's some limits on the fine, money fine, but there's no limits on the sentencing. There's sentencing guidelines. There's amount of time for each crime and for recidivism, people that repeat crime, and all of that. That's true. When you have a corporation, the legislature of the state of New York, in executing its public policy, has decided that they would rather put the powerful basket and arsenal of tools and sanctions on the civil side and not on the criminal side, understanding that individuals will go to jail, but there's sort of limits to what penal, criminal, the New York State legislature wants to do, because they want the enforcement action to come on the New York Attorney General side. It is a unique decision that each state makes and each state legislature makes about how they want their criminal code and their civil code, their attorney general and their local district attorneys and prosecutors to work together to fight corruption and crime. And they do it in different ways. But that's a decision that got made by the legislature, not by accident. It wasn't like they forgot to raise the fines, although there is now a move afoot because of so much heat and light that's being put on the amount of the fine, the low amount of the fine, for the New York legislature and Governor Hochul to take up increasing those fines to more of a federal level for things like money laundering and tax evasion. But in the meantime, rest assured that the DA's office asked for the highest penalty allowed against a company in sentencing and received the highest penalty allowed in New York by the judge, Judge Merchan, in sentencing last week of the Trump organization's two companies, Trump Corporation and Trump Payroll. Now, let's quickly switch gears and talk about, how does the New York legislature want companies to be penalized, sanctioned, and potentially given the equivalent of the death penalty, and who's got the power to do that? It's the New York Attorney General, who, as I said in last night's Legal AF, that office probably has the most powerful set of tools in their basket, in their arsenal of any attorney general. There may be some that match it, but there are none that are going to surpass what is in the New York Attorney General's power under 6312 of the New York executive law. If that office finds ongoing fraud by a company, they can and will do the following. And we're seeing it writ large in the civil fraud case that is being brought by Letitia James's office against Donald Trump and his individual children. What can the New York Attorney General do that the prosecutors can't do? They can give the company the death penalty. They can effectively put them out of business, require that all of the people who were officers, Donald Trump and children, never serve in that role ever again for any company in the state of New York, never serve as officers and directors of a public company for a very long period of time, if not a lifetime ban. They can disgorge that company of all what's called ill-gotten gains, money that it should not have received in profits and revenue and other things that it needs to return. Sometimes we call that damages in a civil case, but when we're talking about taking money, clawing it back from the hands of wrongdoers, it's often referred to as disgorgement. That $250 million that we keep talking about related to Trump and the children in the Trump Organization in the civil fraud case, that's really disgorgement. There may be a fine on top of that, and so there's fines that are also obtainable in the civil context under 6312 by the New York Attorney General. And then there's also the ability to deny the company any kind of licenses that's necessary to operate business in the state of New York. You put all those things together, and that company and the ability of the individuals like Donald Trump to continue to do business in the state of New York is over. Not because necessarily the criminal 17-count conviction was obtained, although I do want to talk next about what happens in the real world, in the business world, in the lending world, in the insurance world, in the government contract world, because of the conviction. So they're not for nothing. And people shouldn't just look to the 1.6 million fine and say, that's all there is? There's nothing else? Let's put that aside for a moment. Civil side, death penalty, an independent financial monitor. She already has, Letitia James already has that in place. Asking for disgorgement, she's asking for disgorgement. Asking to have these people, these bad people, banned from running public companies or New York corporations in the future, she's asking for that as well. So there'll be a full trial in front of this different judge, Judge Engeron, in New York State Supreme Court also, in the civil part of New York State Supreme. Mershon is in the criminal part of the same court system. And we'll get that trial in the spring. And when Letitia James is done putting on, and her prosecutors are done putting on all of the evidence before a New York jury, she is likely to walk out with a conviction, in this case, a ruling, a judgment, an award by the jury. Now, the jury in that case is really used for fact development and fact finding. They are the triers of fact. When it comes to punishments and the implementation of the New York Attorney General 6312 powers, that will return to the judge, who, with the guidance of the facts developed by the jury, will then impose all of these sanctions, fines, disgorgement, bans, and all of that. So it's not necessarily the jury that's going to say, Donald Trump should be banned from ever running a New York office. They will develop all of the facts that will support such a conclusion and such an imposition by the judge. So the jury there guides the judge, fact develops for the judge imposes all of these rules. As long as there is ongoing fraud, New York Attorney General cannot be beat. No prosecutor can beat her anywhere. She has, and that's why those powers that she has, those superpowers that the New York legislature has given her, which are, if you're talking about two superheroes, she beats any of the prosecutors because of what she can do under this unique statute. But she works hand in glove with prosecutors such as the Manhattan DA's office when she needs to, because there's limits to her abilities on the criminal side. Now, sometimes I hear commentators say that the Attorney General has no criminal jurisdiction in the state of New York, and that's not true. She has a limited but exclusive jurisdiction to regulate in the areas of securities fraud, stock fraud, and the like. So if you have a fraud related to the sale of securities or stock, her office and her office alone doesn't have to be in consultation or collaboration with a criminal prosecutor, can prosecute the case. Because within the New York Attorney General's office, she has a criminal division. It has a criminal enforcement and financial crimes bureau, and it has a public integrity bureau, which is what you use to go after politicians who have committed crimes. And then she has an organized crime task force and some other bureaus and commissions within that. So she has a narrow but really important set of criminal powers, superpowers, in the state of New York. She's not using them here because as it relates to Donald Trump, she can't exercise her. A lot of people are saying, we want Tish James. Let Tish James take over. Forget Alvin Bragg in the Manhattan DA's office. Doesn't work because the types of crimes that Trump is currently being prosecuted for related to inflation of his properties improperly in order to get loans that he's not entitled to, deflating values in order to lower his taxes, and all of those things that the Trump organization is accused of, those don't fall neatly or at all within the New York Attorney General's criminal remit or basket. That's why you see a lot of joint operations. We've seen a number of them between Letitia James's New York Attorney General's office and the Manhattan DA's office. I'll give you a few. The Trump Organization and the prosecution of the Trump Organization was a collaboration between the New York Attorney General on the civil side and her prosecutors and her investigators and her financial investigators and supplementing Alvin Bragg and Manhattan DA's office for that crime, working together. They even put attorneys and investigators and deputized them in each other's offices to show the closeness of this relationship. We have another example of that. In the current prosecution of Steve Bannon by the New York State Manhattan DA's office for fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy related to the Build the Wall Foundation, picking up from the federal conviction where he was pardoned and now taking it into New York state law violations and criminal violations where he wasn't. That, again, was an announcement jointly in September of 2022 by the Manhattan DA's office and Alvin Bragg and the New York Attorney General's office headed by Letitia James, with people working on the team like a Mission Impossible, perfect team of people to join, being selected, joining together to work together against Steve Bannon. So this happens more frequently than people that are sort of new to legal analysis give credit to. But we're here to report on it so people have the facts. So this is sort of a summary that I've now provided, sort of a primer of why the New York legislature has a very lower set of fines that people are upset about. But they understand, the same legislature understands that they have a very robust superhero in the New York Attorney General, whoever is in that office, currently occupied, of course, by Letitia James, who has tremendous power to go after ongoing fraud. And let's be frank, most companies that commit bad acts are gone after civilly by the Securities and Exchange Commission, by the CFTC, by the Civil Division of the Department of Justice. Only for the most egregious conduct that rises to the level of a crime do you see criminal prosecutions, understanding that 90% or more, 95% or more of companies are regulated through civil enforcement. That's where the New York State legislature put all their eggs mainly in that basket, civil, and gave their New York Attorney General really strong powers and gave some, but not tremendous fine powers, monetary powers, sanction powers to the prosecutor side and the judge. Think of it this way. If all of the powers were over on the criminal side, not every case rises to the level of a crime. You'd get a lot of bad conduct, bad actor companies that would sort of escape real punishment because you had a weak civil fraud or civil enforcement mechanism. Now, you could balance these a little better, and there is a move afoot now because of all the spotlight that's been put on how low of a fine system and scheme New York State has related to corporate crime, of increasing New York State penal code fines for companies in sentencing who have committed crimes to match higher or to match more the criminal federal side of the equation. So I do think that we'll see an increase in the amount of fines, the level of fining in the future. But again, rest assured, New York Attorney General, under her 6312 powers under the executive law of New York, is full throttle going after Donald Trump and his children simultaneously for fraud. And at the end of the day, it will likely result in a death penalty being given to those companies and those individuals from a civil context, putting them out of business, not allowing them to ever run a company ever again in the state of New York. Michael Popok with continuing coverage of the New York scheme, civil and criminal, being used against Donald Trump and his children related to their fraudulent conduct.
At MeidasTouch, we are unapologetically pro-democracy, and we demand justice and accountability. That's why we're spreading our message to Convict 45. That's right, gear up right now with your Convict 45 tees and pins at store.meidastouch.com. That's store.meidastouch.com.